Welcome to Off the Page. I am Will Cain, and I'm with Bob Costa. So, Bob, I don't think I've never sat around on a Monday night and watched C-SPAN. But you emailed me and you said you'd like to talk about the Rand Paul-Trey Grayson debate. So I tuned in. And I have to thank you, my friend. It was awesome. Don't you think?
It was amazing. It was quite a debate, wasn't it?
Yeah. Before we get into the substance, we need to set this up for the viewers, because Hollywood could not have scripted this debate better. Of course, you had Paul versus Grayson, outsider versus insider, ideologue versus pragmatist. But more importantly, you had a very large Jim Stevenson with a pink pocket square, a cane, and numerous invocations of God. And you had 86-year-old Gurley Martin. And Gurley stole the show. Right?
Gurley Martin, an 86-year-old Senate candidate, really stole the show. He defined the night, I think.
We should
saying
say
that Rand Paul and Trey Grayson were just yelling at each other the whole night.
Yeah, so real quick, for the viewers, throughout the debate, Gurley said that Kagan was not a legit Supreme Court pick because Obama's not a legit president, revealing himself as a birther. He mused about one world government. He approvingly told the story of a hanging in his hometown. He got severely PO'd at the moderator, spoke at a rate of about, 5 words a minute, and at one point had to be told to shut up by a moderator 30 years his junior. He was classic. But
classic political debate. I mean, you really never see anything like that anymore.
Gosh, you don't. Okay, to the substance. Who do you think won, Paul or Grayson?
Oh, I think Rand Paul won. Rand Paul was able to stay on his heels a little bit, but he never let Grayson knock him over. And Rand Paul is ahead in the polls, and he was able to show last night that he's really capturing this Tea Party spirit in Kentucky. And it looks like he could ride that wave right to the U.S. Senate.
Yeah, one thing that became obvious is these two guys don't like each other. It was personal, and at times Paul was a little defensive.
Very defensive. I mean, here you got a guy, Rand Paul, who's been endorsed by Jim Dobson, he's been endorsed by Jim DeMint, he's been endorsed by Senator Jim Bunning, and he's going up against Mitch McConnell's friend, Trey Grayson, Secretary of State of Kentucky. And man, the animosity between these two is personal, it's nasty, and I think it's reflective of what's happening right now in a lot of GOP primaries. There's a real establishment versus a Tea Party crowd, and you really see that in Rand Paul, Trey Grayson. It's a classic primary, and when it comes up on May 18th, you're going to see really what part of the GOP, what part of conservatism is really winning at the ballot box this year.
Yeah, on the two biggest issues of our time, at least within the conservative world, debt and deficit and national security, you saw a marked disagreement between these guys. First, on debt and deficit and entitlements, Paul sounded like the grown-up. He was making concrete suggestions about how to reform Social Security, to increase age limits. And I have to say, on this topic, Grayson sounded like a politician, unwilling to make a commitment to any substantive change. Of course, he was willing to admit the need for change, but not really put forth any idea for change.
That's a great point. You saw throughout the entire night that Rand Paul was able to take just a bit more of a stronger position on things like the entitlement, things like the debt, on issues like the earmarks that are coming out of Congress, on spending. And Trey Grayson was always, maybe you disagree with me here, Will, but I always thought Trey Grayson was trying to have a different stance than Rand Paul, and it always was a little bit more to the center, a little bit more enabling of the federal government, sympathetic towards the federal power, the power of the purse, as Trey Grayson kept talking about. So Rand Paul was able to stake out a position way to the right on spending.
Right.
And I think that really caught some appeal for him, for viewers, I'm sure, because he was able to come up across as a really anti-Washington candidate, someone who's going against the establishment. And Trey Grayson, regardless of how conservative he is, didn't seem like the bold candidate. That was Rand Paul last night.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, but the one place where Grayson did attempt to be bold and draw a line between the two of them was on national security, and he tried to make a big distinction between he and Paul, for example, on Iran, don't you think?
I think Trey Grayson is really making a big bet on national security. Last night he talked about how Rand Paul had maybe flip-flop on issues whether a nuclear-armed Iran would pose a threat to the United States, and really tried to challenge Rand Paul about whether he thought the U.S. should attack someone like Iran, if we had a threat, really testing Rand Paul on national security. And that's what it seems like Trey Grayson is gambling his whole campaign on. He's saying Kentucky won't trust Rand Paul on national security. He's too much like his father, who's an isolationist in many ways down in Texas, Ron Paul, the former presidential candidate. Yeah. So the big question now is, what's the issue in Kentucky for Republicans? Right. Is it things like the debt and entitlements, which Rand Paul is very strong on, or is it going to be national security? And if it's national security, Trey Grayson has a shot at winning this race.
Yeah, you're right. Grayson definitely tried to paint Paul as kooky. That was the word, in fact, used last
That was right. Kooky. That's right.
Okay, so you think Paul won the debate. What's your prediction? The primary is what, May 18th?
That's right, May 18th.
What's your prediction?
I think Rand Paul's in a very strong position. He's ahead in the polls by 10 points in most polls, around something like that. And Trey Grayson had an interesting line last night. He said that the GOP is a three-legged stool. He cited Reagan and saying, they're social conservatives, national conservatives, economic conservatives. He says, that's where I am. I'm a Reagan three-stooled conservative representing all those wings. And so you have a real establishment versus anti-establishment candidate. It may not come down always to the issues, but whether voters identify with someone who's willing to vote against Mitch McConnell, willing to rail against Washington. And what we saw in Utah just this past weekend is even someone who's considered conservative by many, like Bob Bennett, is thrown out by some in the Republican Party.
Right. So
it's going to be interesting to see if Trey Grayson is treated like an establishment conservative. Even though he's not a U.S. Senator right now, he's the only Secretary of State. He's running for federal office for the first time. And so I think Rand Paul he's part of this wave that's going across the country. What do you think, Will?
Well, I don't know, but I want to ask you what I really meant is, what do you think? Who will come out higher in the polls, Gurley Martin or Jim Stevenson? What are Gurley Martin's chances? That's what I want to know.
It's hard for viewers, I think, who weren't watching this debate to see how funny Gurley Martin was. I mean, this is an 86-year-old grandfather who was out there saying, in many ways, some telling lines, even though 99% of what he said was pretty absurd, and his anecdotes about hangings and other things was very odd and off-putting. But he had one line where he said, when Grayson and Rand Paul were arguing with each other, you guys are destroying each other. And I think that said a lot about last night's debate and this GOP primary in Kentucky, that Rand Paul and Trey Grayson are just really butting heads all the time. And whether that's going to hurt them in the general, we'll have to see.
Right. Okay, you guys can find Bob on nationalreview.com. Follow me on Twitter at Will Cain.